Okay, so this one's a little bit different from what I usually do, and I couldn't think of a good intro, so let me start off by asking a question. Open world or linear games? Which one do you prefer, and why? I have been thinking about this particular question a lot lately because I like to think about random bullshit. And as I was thinking about this, some other questions came to mind. Aren't linear games always strictly start from point A and end at point B? And what exactly even makes a game open world? Is it as simple as here's a big map, there you go, now it's open world? And where do sandbox games fit in with all of this? Open world and sandbox are often used together or synonymously, but are they really that similar? As I was writing down my thoughts, I decided I wanted to make a video about this because, well, why not? Might as well, right? So grab yourself a nice cup of coffee, because this is going to be a long one, and let's talk about open worlds versus linear levels. The open world genre is still one of the most popular genres these days, but what exactly does open world even mean, and why do so many people love it? The definition of open world generally includes the following criteria: non-linearity, and a massive map that gives you a free-roaming environment with limited restrictions on where you can go. So they allow you to freely roam and explore the world you're playing in, giving you a sense of freedom. There are different ways an open world can be done, but before I go into that, I want to talk about a concept called spectrum of linearity. We can view open world and linear as a spectrum, where if open world is on the one end, linear will be on the other. Most games will fall somewhere in between. So games can be open world and still have some linear elements, and vice versa. Some open worlds focus more on the exploration aspect, encouraging the player to just go out into the world and discover everything there is to see by themselves. They don't really guide the player anywhere, making exploration feel more natural. Just by doing things in the world, the player will figure out where they need or want to go. This kind of open world will lean more towards the open world end of the spectrum. Good examples of this are games like Elden Ring and Breath of the Wild. An open world that leans a little bit more towards the other end of the spectrum is one that might focus more on following a storyline and steering the player in a certain direction, having them follow one or more main objectives while still giving them the choice to do side quests whenever they want to or in whatever order they want to. This makes exploring feel less natural, but if you're a person with no sense of direction that gets lost easily, it's really nice to have a big shiny quest marker telling you where to go. That's me, by the way. I'm a person with no sense of direction. Examples of games that follow this kind of structure are games like Dragon Age Inquisition, Assassin's Creed, or the Horizon games. As I mentioned at the start of this video, the terms open world and sandbox are often used interchangeably, and it is true that open world games often overlap with sandbox mechanics. Though, while they do often overlap, they are different. Open world refers to the lack of limits for the player's exploration of the game's world. You are a character that exists in that world and you're playing through its story. Sandbox games are based on the ability of giving you tools for creative freedom within the game. So basically, here's your world, here are your tools to create things, have fun. There is no narrative to follow and there is no end goal apart from what you make of it yourself. Just like playing in an actual sandbox, which is where the name comes from. Open worlds are not always sandboxes, and sandboxes are not always open world, but they can be combined. So now that we've lightly touched on what an open world game can be, what makes them so popular? Well, there are specific things that define an open world game, things that people generally really like, and things that people generally dislike. To make things easier, I have just listed everything in a nice pros and cons list, starting off with the pros. Free roaming. As I mentioned earlier, one of the things that defines the open world genre is the fact that they allow you to freely roam and explore the world that you're playing in with very little limitations. So this means that there aren't any artificial barriers like invisible walls or loading screens while you're walking around in the world. Or, a random stick that blocks your path and is absolutely impossible to step over despite it being just a stick on the ground. The end of a map is usually shown by things that would naturally be in the world, like a heavy sandstorm, a sea, or a cliff. Free roaming is great if you enjoy exploring and searching every corner of the map for secrets and Easter eggs, or if you like to just walk around the world and enjoy the scenery. It makes the world feel more natural as well. Player autonomy. Open world games give you considerable freedom in choosing when or how to approach objectives. You can choose to do all or most of the side quests first before doing the main quest. You can switch between main quest or side content, or if you just want to focus on your main objective, you can choose to ignore the side content. Most of it is usually completely skippable. This also means that you are given the freedom to develop your character and their behavior in the direction and pace that you want. Replayability. When exploring a big open world map filled with quests, NPCs, bosses, and whatever you can think of, it's likely you're not going to experience everything on your first playthrough, which means your second playthrough will most likely be different from the first one. You can create a new character or play your character in a different way, take other paths, and run into things you might have missed the first time. You can make different choices, experience another ending, approach objectives in a different way. Basically, open world games usually have a lot of replay value because each new playthrough is likely to be different from the previous one. Now, there is no doubt that the pros of this list are part of what makes open world games so popular with players. Though of course there's also the aspect of video game trends and the fact that when one recipe for a game seems to do well, in this case open world, other video game developers or publishers try to do the same thing. And they want to be the next Skyrim or the next, I don't know, Witcher 3 or whatever. You know what I mean. And you know, we've seen similar things with the battle royales and the live services where companies try to shoehorn this specific thing into a game where it doesn't belong. But anyway, that's a whole other topic that I'm not gonna get into right now. Of course they do this in the hopes of also getting a taste of that success, or in a lot of cases, money. Of course, this isn't always the developer's fault, and usually when these things happen, it is because of a decision that came from higher up in the company. In the case of open world, there are plenty of examples of games that succeeded in giving the players what they want from an open world game. Unfortunately, the opposite is also true. When done right, the open world will feel alive and immersive. Everywhere you go, there is something new to see, whether that's a new quest, a boss to fight, NPCs you can talk to, or just creatures walking around the area. The world feeling alive is very important for an open world game, and that brings me to the first con on this list. Empty worlds. When done wrong, you might end up with a world that feels empty. If there are not enough things in the world to pique your interest, you most likely won't feel compelled to explore it further. And even if you do so, it will most likely be boring, because there isn't much to see or do. It can also be quite immersion breaking. Imagine your character walking through a village that is filled with unique looking NPCs that are doing their own thing. Some are walking around, some are standing and talking to each other, maybe there's NPCs trying to sell you stuff. There's ambient dialogue, there are some animals walking around, you know, things like that. It looks like an actual village where the people have their own lives. You're more likely to feel immersed here than when you walk through a village that has nothing but two very similar looking NPCs who are just standing around and waiting for you to talk to them. Fetch quests. To counter the empty world problem, the maps are often filled with lots of side quests. The problem is that most of those quests will be what we call fetch quests. They're usually not very interesting. They don't add much to the world and they often require you to collect X amount of whatever item you can think of or go kill X amount of whatever creature needs killing. One or two of these types of quests are okay, but add too many of them to your world and they will get very repetitive very fast, and so we end up just not doing them. Especially if a quest requires you to find items that are very annoying to get to. And the amount of said item you need is, I don't know, like 126? Shards and Age Inquisition. There's that weird cough again, sorry about that. Overwhelming. So, because the maps are often so large and filled with so many things, open world games can often feel very overwhelming. Especially if you're kind of a completionist like me and want to explore every single corner of the map and do every single side quest. For me, playing a game for the first time and seeing such large maps full of quests and all sorts of icons just makes me go, oh my god, where do I start and how long is this going to take me? Oh, and that reminds me. Time consuming. Large open world games often take a lot of time. Though while I listed this as a con, it can be both good and bad depending on the person. If I say this game takes about 100 hours to complete, some people will get excited because they enjoy being able to fully dive into a game and spend all the time that they have, while others might not have as much free time to do so. They will prefer to play shorter games instead, and so hearing that a game takes 100 hours to complete might scare them off and make them want to skip it because they won't have time to complete it anyway, or they feel like it would just take them too long. Players are unpredictable. For developers, one of the difficulties of designing an open world game is that it is difficult to predict how players will behave. A major design challenge is to balance the freedom of an open world with the structure of a storyline. Because players may do things that the game designer did not expect, the game's writers need to find creative ways to impose a storyline on the player without interfering with their freedom. Because of this, open world games will often break the game's story into a series of missions or quests, or have a much simpler storyline altogether. Story pacing. Speaking of storyline, because of the challenge I mentioned in my previous point, it's hard to get the story pacing right in an open world game. So when looking at this from a player's perspective, playing a game where the story pacing is off can be very immersion breaking. If things happen way too fast, it can be confusing and can cause someone to lose track of the story and eventually lose interest. Or if everything happens way too slowly, you could get bored and also lose interest. Now that we've covered the open worlds part of this video, let's talk about the linear levels. Okay, so when I say linear levels, I'm not necessarily talking about a fully linear game. So what's the difference? Let's start off by looking at what a linear game actually means. So the quickest way to explain linear games is to compare them with reading a book. There is a start and an end, and the game has a set path for you to follow, and that path is the only way to get to the end. Going back to the spectrum of linearity concept I talked about earlier, this would be the very other end of it. But as I said, most games will fall somewhere in the middle, so usually when we say a game is linear, we are referring to either its linear story or its linear levels. Games with linear stories will have you play from story point A to story point B to C, etc. You'll play as an already existing character, complete with their own personality and background. You are experiencing the story through their eyes, and your actions do not affect the story or its characters in any way. Linear levels are levels or maps that have only one way to the exit. There could be side paths, and you could backtrack, but in the end there is only one specific way to get through the level, and only one way to deal with the objectives. And usually these levels can only be played in a specific order. So you start with level 1, then 2, and then 3, rather than picking which area you want to go to first or going back and forth between them. So if a game has either one of these, it's a linear game, but what if a game has mostly linear maps with a mostly set story, but allows the player to make small choices here and there? Can we still call it a linear game? I mean, it has the linear levels, right? Well, yes and no. Yes, because most of the game's elements are linear, but also no, because it's not fully linear. We can affect the story in some way. And this is why I like the spectrum concept, because most games aren't strictly linear. In this case, the game would be very close to the linear side, but not there completely. So how do games that are more linear compare to open world games when it comes to pros and cons? Story and pacing. Linear games often have a better paced story. Because there aren't many ways for the player to tackle objectives, it is much easier for the developers to fully flesh out the story and focus on getting the pacing right, without having to worry about balancing it with the player's freedom, like they have to do in open world games. Not as overwhelming. As I mentioned before, the maps in linear games are not as big as the ones in open worlds, and they usually have one entrance and one exit, and maybe a few side areas to explore. This means the developers don't have to worry about their map feeling empty, and so they don't have to fill it with as many quests. And so we as a player aren't getting overwhelmed by the 80 different quest markers and the 50 landmarks to discover. Not as time consuming. So of course this very much depends on the game, but keeping in mind that linear games tend to have smaller maps means there is less to explore, which means you'll most likely spend much less time on that. And of course it also depends on what kind of player you are. If you're like me and like to explore every single corner of the map because you don't want to miss anything, you're more likely to spend time on a game versus someone who just wants to sit back, chill, and play through the story. Typically, linear games are shorter and take less time to play through. And as I mentioned before, if you're someone who just doesn't have that much free time, you're probably more likely to play a game that doesn't take 100 hours to complete. Clear goals and guidance. Linear games will often give you a clear goal. Something that clearly shows where you have to go or what you have to do, like a quest log or an objectives list, or a simple quest marker on the map. Or when there are no quest markers, the maps usually have a clear layout and will make it obvious where the game wants you to go, which means you're also less likely to get lost. Like I often do. So these were the pros of linear games. Now let's look at the cons. Not much player autonomy. As I've explained earlier in the video, linear games don't give you much autonomy. Usually your objectives, missions, or quests, or whatever you want to call them, have to be done in a specific order. and there is usually one way these quests can be resolved. And so you don't have the freedom to choose when or how you want to do these quests like you do in open world games. On rails. Playing through a linear game feels like what is often described as being on rails, as like usual in linear games, you're following a set path. This means that you're often given little to no room to explore, no hidden treasures to find, and no secrets to discover. The same goes for story. There is a start, a middle, and an end. No choices to make, and no multiple different endings. Not as much replayability. Games that have a linear storyline usually don't give you the ability to affect the story or your character's actions in any way, or not enough that it matters. This means that no matter what you do, you'll always get the same outcomes and the same ending. Because you've already seen most, if not everything the game has to offer, you're a lot less likely to play through the game again. Now before I wrap this up, there is something I haven't really touched on yet, which is gameplay. Naturally, gameplay can add to the replay value of a game. Some games don't even really have a storyline, or if they do have one, it might just be fluff and the focus is more on gameplay specifically. A linear game can easily have a lot of replay value if the gameplay is fun, if it offers you the ability of trying out different character builds, or if you can try the game on a higher difficulty. At the end of the day, it's all a matter of taste, and everyone will have their own reasons for liking or disliking certain games. So, now that I've talked about open worlds and linear levels, I am very curious to what you guys think. Which one do you prefer, and why? As for my own opinion, well, I think I like a game that's a nice mix of the two. I love it when games have player choice and branching narratives with multiple different endings, and I want to feel the impact of the choices I make in the game. And I really enjoy being able to create my own character as well. No, really, I can spend ages on character creation, and I enjoy every single minute of it. In terms of the game's world though, I think I prefer a more linear approach over open world. I do like exploring, but open world games just tend to make me feel overwhelmed. I prefer maps that give me enough areas to explore, but aren't so big that it would take me ages to explore everything. And that's it, I guess. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked this video, let me know by liking this video. Or leave a comment and tell me all about your own pros and cons list for open world and linear games. Maybe I missed something. Definitely let me know if I did. I know this is very different from my usual content, but it's a subject I really enjoyed researching and talking about. So despite it being something different, I really hope you liked it. And if you did, make sure to keep an eye on my channel, because I will be touching upon this subject in future videos, especially one that I'm working on right now, in which I'll talk about the linearity and open world structure of the Dragon Age games, and whether or not I think Dragon Age Dreadwolf should be open world or not. But that's all for now though. Thanks again for watching, and I hope to see you on the next one.